In my video on Penda of Mercia, I quickly mentioned the concept of Anglo-Saxon Imperium. I only mentioned it very briefly though, and I didn't get to talk about it in nearly as much detail as the topic really deserves. The relationships between Anglo-Saxon kings and kingdoms could be quite complex and are easily misunderstood. There were several kingdoms of various sizes, and oftentimes a handful of them dominated the rest. But the nature of that dominion can often be misconstrued. So today I'm going to shed some light onto what that Imperium really was, and what it looked like in Anglo-Saxon England. So there are two terms that we need to understand if we're going to tackle this topic. The first is the aforementioned Imperium, and the second is Bretwalda or Bretwalda. Imperium is a Latin word. During the Roman Republic, it meant something like authority or command. It was something that you had as consul or praetor, two of the highest elected officials which commanded armies. Imperium also came to mean the territory over which you held that authority. Imperium is also where we get the word empire, because eventually the Roman Empire came to be known in Latin as the Imperium Romanorum, and the emperor was the imperator, the one holding Imperium. Imperium is also related to the verb imperare, which meant to command, and eventually came to mean to rule over. The term Imperium is applied to the Anglo-Saxon context most famously by the Northumbrian monk Bede, in his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, or Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written in the 730s, which is one of our main sources of information about early Anglo-Saxon history. Bede uses Imperium and Imperare frequently, and it's often used quite interchangeably with regnum, or kingdom, though sometimes it seems to be specifically used for a king ruling over the lands of another kingdom. However, there's one place he uses it where it's a lot more impactful. In Book 2, Chapter 5, Bede talks about the death of King Athelbert of Kent. He writes that Athelbert imperavit, or held Imperium, over all the kingdoms of the English south of the Humber, and that he was the third king to do so. Bede then lists all the kings who held such Imperium: Aella of Sussex, Ceolin of Wessex, Athelbert of Kent, Redwald of East Anglia, Edwin of Northumbria, Oswald of Northumbria, and finally Oswiu, or Oswy, of Northumbria. As for the term Bretwalda, it appears in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which are a series of chronicles originally created in the late 800s at the court of Alfred the Great of Wessex, and they were added to over the years, with one version being updated all the way to 1154. In one entry for Alfred's grandfather Ecbert of Wessex, Ecbert is said to have conquered southern England and become Bretwalda, meaning Britain ruler, after which the chronicle lists the 7 kings Bede mentioned as holding Imperium, adding Ecbert as the 8th. Together, these references led older historians to assume that the title of Bretwalda was a formal office in Anglo-Saxon England, held by a powerful king, possibly even being elected by the other kings, and that this was a precursor to the Kingdom of England. In fact, some saw this as evidence that the English had always been a unified people, and that the various kingdoms of the early Anglo-Saxon period were a fragmentation, but that all recognized the Bretwalda as the High King of England. This, however, is wrong. Bede's use of Imperium needs to be looked at in light of his own early medieval context, and the purpose of his writings. His history is not a history that can always be taken at face value. It's propagandistic and highly providential. He sees the English as God's chosen people to rule over the island of Britain, drawing similarities to both the Romans and the Israelites. In fact, throughout the Historia Ecclesiastica, it's clear that the Old Testament narratives of the Israelites and their struggles are his models. When the Israelites forget God, they suffer, and when they're faithful, they return to glory. And there's several instances of that very thing in Bede's history. For example, when Egfrith of Northumbria is killed in battle against the Picts in 685, rather than saying that the Picts had divine support, Bede says that Egfrith was being punished for raiding Irish churches and monasteries the year before. The spiritual connection of the English to the Romans is also significant. Bede sees Roman rule over Britain as legitimate, and he follows in the typical medieval tradition of believing that Christ sanctioned the Roman Empire by choosing to become man and sacrifice himself in it. And also in Matthew 22:21, when he told his followers to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, i.e., pay your taxes. Even before Rome was converted to Christianity, God used it for his divine plan, and Bede sees the arrival and dominance of the pagan Anglo-Saxons in a similar light. They are an imperial people. The dominion of the Anglo-Saxons, their eventual conversion, and the miracles which take place in their lands are prophetic, and they parallel the history of the Romans in Britain. This is the context we need when we're looking at Bede's list of 7 kings. First of all, the fact that there are 7 is clearly symbolic, since 7's an important number in Christianity, while also recalling things like the traditional 7 kings of Rome. The kings Bede chose are also important. He had to have Athelbert of Kent in there because he was the first to accept Christianity, and he's intimately tied to the sacred history of the English. That isn't to say, though, that Bede invented his Imperium. Even Pope Gregory the Great's letters quoted by Bede mention the fact that Athelbert was a powerful king who had several other kings as his subjects. Though Bede was likely exaggerating when he said his Imperium was over every kingdom south of the Humber. The first 2 kings, Aelle of Sussex and Ceawlin of Wessex, are largely unknown, and they might have been included because they were popular heroic figures. They also elevate Athelbert, since Pope Gregory tells him that his conversion will place him above his predecessors, so he had to have predecessors. Radwald of East Anglia, the 4th, is quite interesting. He was under Athelbert's Imperium until the latter's death, and he was baptized in Kent, but he's called an apostate by Bede because he never fully rejected pagan religious practices, famously having a temple with a statue of Christ alongside pagan gods. Now, Radwald might have seen himself as a worshipper of Christ until his death, and just held a different understanding of religion from Bede. But regardless, from Bede's own perspective, this is a bit of a smudge in his narrative. Even so, he probably had no choice but to list him since he was so integral in the rise of the next person in the list, Edwin of Northumbria, who only gained his throne thanks to Radwald defeating Athelfrith of Bernicia, who had previously driven Edwin into exile. It was this victory that thrust Radwald into a position of Imperium. The last 3, Edwin, Oswald, and Oswiu, were all kings of Northumbria. They were, as with all the others on the list, powerful kings who held Imperium beyond their own kingdom. But Bede doesn't end his list with them because they were the last ones to do so. Edwin may very well have held dominion over all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and possibly even the Welsh kingdoms and the Isle of Man. Oswiu may have done the same, at least for a couple of years, but he also managed to subjugate the Britons, Picts, and Gaels of what is today Scotland. Oswiu was therefore the apogee of Imperium over Britain, according to Bede. His Imperium was the peak. He fulfilled the divine mandate given to the English, and he also sealed it by tying the Northumbrian Church, which had been following the Irish tradition, to Roman norms through the Council of Whitby, unifying the Church in England. It also needs to be pointed out here that Bede was not apolitical. He might have been a monk living in a monastery since he was 7, but he was connected to the Northumbrian court, and the Historia Ecclesiastica was likely written to be read by members of that court. The king at the time, Ceolwulf, was a descendant of Oswiu, and Bede's list of kings essentially sanctifies his dynasty's dominion over all of Britain. But this was more of an ambition than it was a reality. Bede likely exaggerated the Imperium of several of the kings on his list, in some cases knowingly and in other cases maybe not. There were lots of powerful kings which he didn't mention, sometimes because they ruled at the same time as those in his list, but he had to only have one at a time in order to make it an orderly providential succession. In fact, most of the time, there were probably at least 2 powerful kings with their own sphere of dominion competing against each other, if not more. At other times, Bede was hostile towards those kings, like Penda of Mercia, as I mentioned in my video about him, as well as the king of Mercia in Bede's own day, Athelbald, who Bede even notes as having wide influence over the south. As for the Bretwalda, Britain ruler, it's unlikely that this was ever a title that anyone used. First of all, Bretwalda is only in one version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, called the A Chronicle. The B through F Chronicles instead use Britanwalda, which actually means powerful or wide ruler, likely as an attempt to translate the concept of Imperium into Old English. And it's likely that Bretwalda was a copying mistake, possibly tied to the fact that Welsh kings are called Bretwallas in the chronicle. Even so, that single entry in the chronicle is the only time that Bretwalda or Britanwalda are ever attested, and it's unlikely that it was a widespread term. We have to remember that, like Bede's Historia, the Anglo-Saxon chronicle was not created without an agenda. It was originally created at the court of a king who saw himself as overlord of all the English, and who genuinely was overlord of all the English who were not ruled by Viking invaders. The chronicle presents Anglo-Saxon history in a way that shows Wessex as being their guide, its kings as the chosen kings, and Alfred being their hope for the future. Ecgbert of Wessex being the 8th king to hold Imperium legitimizes Alfred and his successors' claims of dominion over all of the English. The closest thing we actually have to Bretwalda is Rex Britanniae, used by Athelbald of Mercia. However, it's only used in one of the 8 charters that we have for him, and he's the only one that we know that used it, so it clearly wasn't a standardized title. And even in his case, it was clearly more of an ambition, a symbolic claim than anything else. Okay, so far I've been talking about Imperium in a fairly abstract way. Overlordship, hegemony, dominion, authority. But what really was it? How did it work? Well, first of all, we need to know how kingship worked. Like I mentioned in my video about Penda of Mercia, early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were not bureaucratic, centralized governments. They became a little bit more so as time went on, especially once England was a single kingdom. But before the time of Alfred, most Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were, anthropologically speaking, chiefdoms. The relationship between a king and his kingdom was itself largely a hegemony. The various landholders and other subjects of the realm had personal ties to the king, and the nature of those ties in part determined one's position, as well as the king's power and authority over the realm. And not every king had full power over his own kingdom. Kings were also military leaders, and most free men were expected to be warriors, especially those who were wealthy, and they were expected to follow their king into battle. Now, not all kings fought all the time, but one's ability to be successful in war often played a big part in obtaining support for one's rule. Other pillars like the giving of gifts to one's supporters was often tied to war, since it either meant giving treasures which had been looted, or things purchased with wealth that had also been looted. War, therefore, was one context in which Imperium could be established. A king who killed another king could often establish himself over that other king's kingdom, but he rarely subsumed that kingdom into his own. Instead, he'd often raise someone else to be king there, someone whose power and kingship, therefore, was dependent on the first king. This new sub-king did remain king over his own realm, and continued to fulfill the role of king over his own people, but he was subservient to the man who gave him power. This is overlordship. Imperium. This is probably a good time to address the fact that Bede seems to have thought this was exactly how Imperium worked amongst the Romans as well. He makes reference to a legendary 2nd century king Lucius of Britain, who might actually be based on a Roman governor, but Bede didn't know what the nature of a governor's power was. He says Lucius was king of Britain, but he also recognizes that Britain was under Roman Imperium at the time. Lucius, then, is a sub-king under the emperor, possibly with other sub-kings under him. Bede was using the idea of overlordship present in his own time to understand Roman Imperium. Now, one difference between one's kingdom and wider Imperium is that Imperium was tied to the individual king rather than the kingdom. Because of this, dynamics of Imperium could change a lot as one overlord died and another rose to fill in the vacuum. Like how Redwald of East Anglia came to be dominant after the death of his previous overlord, Athelbert of Kent, and then Edwin of Northumbria rose up after him. In southern England, Wessex, Sussex, Essex, and Kent all variously jockeyed for power over each other in a sort of local imperium, though Wessex and Kent were successful most often. The personal nature of Imperium was in part due to the fact that it was established by one's own merits, especially when warfare was involved. When an overlord died, His successor would have to prove himself if he hoped to have his own imperium. Bede even sees this as being the case with the Roman emperors as well, and he notes that Nero lost Britain to the Boudiccan revolts because he never waged any wars of his own, and therefore he hadn't established his own imperium. But a king didn't actually have to conquer every other kingdom over which he'd have imperium. In several cases, when a king won a major victory, other kings would submit to him on their own accord, either because they respected his military prowess or because they feared it. This was especially the case for smaller kingdoms like Lindsey or several others which we hardly ever hear about. Kingdoms which may have never been fully autonomous and always connected themselves to powerful overlords. Some kings might have also relied on a more powerful king to become king of their kingdom, and therefore would have regarded the one who helped them come into power as their overking. War wasn't the only way to extend imperium, though. Marriages were often used to create strong ties between two kingdoms, and a father or brother-in-law often obtained the loyalty of his brother or son-in-law when he offered his daughter or sister's hand to a neighboring ruler. Family was very important in Anglo-Saxon society, so tying two families together made for very close bonds. When Ethelbert of Kent converted to Christianity, Essex was one of the first kingdoms beyond Kent to establish a see in London, in part because the King of Essex was Ethelbert's nephew, Sibert, a sub-king. This is also a good time to point out that not all imperium was the same, and there were often various degrees. A king installed through warfare might be at a lower level and owe more tribute to his overlord, but in some cases it was more like an alliance, and it's hard to tell who was overking over who, if at all. In some cases, imperium only really entailed that a sub-king would join his overlord in battle, and maybe that he wouldn't be allowed to wage any wars without his overlord. The situation between Ethelbert and Sibert also shows how Christianity could support imperium, especially in the early era of conversion. Essex got its own bishop quickly because of Sibert's submission to his uncle. On the other hand, Radwald of East Anglia was baptized in Kent, likely adopting his overlord's new god as a sign of his fealty. But he was autonomous enough that Ethelbert couldn't impose his religion's priesthood in East Anglia. When Christianity was established, Kent held the advantage of having the seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury, from whom, in theory, all other English bishops obtained their authority. This didn't guarantee his imperium, though. When Oswio brought the Northumbrian church into conformity with the Roman traditions followed by the rest of England at the Council of Whitby in 664, he made his home bishopric of York a dependent of Canterbury. But a religiously unified England might in turn support his own wide imperium, and the ensuing strong relationship with the archbishop could even strengthen his position over the King of Kent. New archbishoprics were also established which might give some degree of religious autonomy from Canterbury. Most famously, York became independent again, to a degree anyway, in 735. But there was also a short-lived archbishopric in Lichfield, the seat of the Mercian Church, for just over a decade at the end of the 8th century. Now, it did happen that kingdoms absorbed others into themselves and began to treat them as provinces rather than subkingdoms. Sussex and Kent would eventually become part of Wessex, Lindsey part of Mercia, and Deira and Bernicia would eventually be permanently bound and become Northumbria. However, when this happened, it was usually after the subkingdom had been firmly under their overlord's imperium for a long time, and their kings had gradually lost power to the point where they could simply be deposed. It was rarely the direct result of conquest, with some exceptions, like when Wessex and the Northumbrian kingdoms pushed west into Brythonic lands, but these weren't Anglo-Saxons. Even then, there are more instances where a king could only impose overlordship, even over his Celtic neighbors. The complete dismantling of a conquered kingdom wasn't something that most kings seemed interested in doing. Establishing themselves as an overlord often served their purposes better. It might also be safer as well. When Oswio of Northumbria defeated Penda of Mercia in 655, the latter's son Bede, who was married to Oswio's daughter Alflad and had converted to Christianity, became king of southern Mercia as a sub-king under Oswio. What exactly happened with northern Mercia is unclear. nor southern Mercia after Peda's assassination the following year. However, in around 658, a few Mercian nobles rose up and expelled Oswio's foreign princes, as Bede puts it, placing Penda's son Wulfhere onto the throne. These princes might have been sub-kings of Northumbrian rather than Mercian origin, or they might have even been aldermen or some other governor placed by King Oswio in Mercia. If they were aldermen, this would have been an attempt to make Mercia a province of Northumbria. In either case, the Mercian nobles were clearly not willing to accept such a large degree of foreign intervention. Of course, it might have also just been a gamble to improve their own positions by raising up a king who would have been indebted to them. In any case, when one kingdom got subsumed into another, they usually still retained a local identity for a long time, and this was sometimes solidified by the group getting or retaining their own bishop. Some of these local identities, like for example the Reukensatte, lasted for centuries, only disappearing sometime after the Norman conquest. Despite the political centralization efforts in England throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, late Anglo-Saxon England was a rather confederate kingdom. In conclusion, looking back at Imperium as a whole, we can say that yes, there were Anglo-Saxon kings who dominated others. There are some who even dominated all the others, or at least came close. But there was no standardized office of Bretwalda. Overlordship was not an institution. It was fluid, ever-changing, constantly being renegotiated both diplomatically and on the battlefield. The use of the term Imperium shouldn't deceive us into thinking that these were empires. Instead, they were complex webs of personal relationships. And there were usually more than one existing in different parts of Britain at the same time. In fact, the Celtic kingdoms of Britain and even Ireland often had their own webs of overlordship, and these webs occasionally intermeshed. When Bede and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle use lists of kings, they're more of a literary fabrication than anything else, choosing who to include and who to omit, exaggerating or downplaying the influence of various kings in order to make a point. Alfred the Great's overlordship would ultimately lead to the unification of all the English under one king. But this was in part because the Viking invasions of the previous decades had essentially eliminated all competing dynasties. It was this idea that the kings of Wessex were the kings of the English that led the chroniclers of his court to enthusiastically take on Bede's list and apply it just as anachronistically to their own survey of English history. Alfred had ambitions for himself and his successors, just as the kings of Northumbria did in Bede's day to revive the glory of Oswio, and just as Athelbald of Mercia did when he referred to himself as Rex Britanniae. Though, admittedly, Alfred was probably closer to those ambitions being a reality. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.